In May of the year 1908, just 2 years before his death, the great American psychologist and philosopher William James gave a series of lectures at the University of Oxford. During one of his lectures, while discussing the nature of the soul, James expressed to his audience the sentiment of the times. The soul, he said, was out of fashion. Over a century later, and our attitudes towards the soul are still ambiguous. In academic circles where metaphysical materialism holds sway, James's words continue to ring true. The soul is still very much out of fashion. But in the popular opinion, despite a similar tendency towards materialism, the embers of the soul have never been fully extinguished. So how did we reach this point? And will the soul live on, or will it be dismissed once and for all to the historian's museum of curiosities? Join us now at Immaterial Minds as we take a look at this brief history of the soul. Our story begins in ancient Greece. While the Greeks were not, of course, the first to reflect on the nature of the soul, their great literary and philosophic achievements played a crucial role in how we today conceive of the soul, particularly in the Western world. For much of their history, the Greeks interpreted the soul in two ways. On the one hand, there was what we might call the mythological soul. This derived from the earliest Greek literature, that of Homer and Hesiod. We are all familiar with Zeus, god of gods, and of the exploits of his fellow Olympians. But what did Greek mythology make of the individual, human soul? According to Homer, the soul is a shadowy ghost-like figure. Upon death, it escapes our bodies either through our breath or, in some cases, through a gaping wound. And after its escape, it is destined to exist forever with some form of immortality. Beyond this basic theme, however, there are both significant similarities and differences to observe between the mythological soul and how theology views the soul today. In one respect, while the mythological soul is depicted as a representation of us, of our person, it lacks almost all of our characteristic features. As the shade of the fallen Patroclus tells the hero Achilles in Homer's epic, the Iliad, the soul remains after death, but it is burnt out, breathless, lacking its wits. The continuation of our soul, then, is not the continuation of our personality in any substantial sense. We live on, but as nothing more than apparitions. We have a pitiful existence. In contrast to this mythology, the Greeks also developed what we might call an intellectual or reasoned account of the soul. It was in the 6th century BCE, in the Greek region of Ionia, now on the western coast of modern-day Turkey, that the penetrating intellects of the Ionian thinkers began to be dissatisfied with mythological explanations. Instead, they aimed to explain the world and the soul within it in a very different way. They relied on the powers of human reason, and it is in this respect that Greek Ionia became the birthplace of theoretical science. First among the Ionian thinkers was Thales. Thales is known today as the first philosopher, the greatest of the 7 Greek sages, and what we know of his life is shrouded in mystery and legend. To relate just one of many stories, it is said that, when questioned about the utility of his philosophical abilities, Thales used his knowledge of the heavens to predict a great harvest. He then, prior to this harvest, bought all of the olive presses in the region, thereby making a substantial profit. But be that as it may, Thales' contribution to the soul was his reduction of explanation to a single underlying arche, or first principle. Thales reasoned that the underlying principle of all things, that from which all things in the world derive, was water. He came to this conclusion likely because of the versatility of water and, as the later Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote, because of the close relationship between water, nourishment, and life. Thales' view of the world was therefore at once both ancient and modern in its conception of the soul. Modern in its commitment to scientific simplicity. Everything was to be explained according to one principle. Yet ancient in the sense that it did not provide a rigid distinction between a material world of the body and an immaterial world of the soul. For Thales, then, everything was fundamentally matter, material, but matter was animated. That is no doubt why Thales also said that everything was full of gods. The enduring feature of Thales' soul, as history continued to unfold, was not so much its content, but his reasoned approach to understanding it. This methodology has influenced all great thinkers since, from the most ardent of naturalists to the most dogmatic of spiritualists. And his influence was felt immediately by our next two thinkers, Plato and Aristotle. In the vein of Thales, Plato was committed to the use of reason as the supreme means by which to understand the world. But unlike Thales, Plato was not inclined towards naturalism. He was, at heart, a true metaphysician. For Plato, the world could not be reduced to a single naturalistic principle. Instead, he believed that a clear distinction must be drawn between the physical world of perception and the more perfect world of pure intellect. Plato recognized the human capacity for knowledge of universals. We understand redness apart from any particular red object, goatiness apart from any particular goat. And the same is true of mathematics and other abstract notions, such as justice, beauty, and love. Since, however, perception only grants us knowledge of particulars, Plato concluded that universal knowledge must come from somewhere else. It must come, he thought, from a more perfect realm of ideas, or, as they are now known, perfect forms. In light of this metaphysical scheme, the soul for Plato was a mediator between the perfect world of the forms and the imperfect world of perceptual experience. But most importantly, the soul on this view has an existence independent of the body. It resides before its unification with a physical body, in the realm of pure intellect. It lives alongside the forms as a timeless, universal, unchanging entity. This is the feature of Plato's soul that has in various forms continued to permeate history. Plato used reason to begin to solidify the distinction between the material world that we inhabit and a more perfect eternal world, the true home of the soul. The first great alternative to Plato's view then came from our very next Greek thinker, Plato's own student, Aristotle. While Plato was a true metaphysician, Aristotle was, by contrast, a true empirical scientist. Associated with Aristotle's view of the soul is the dictum that the soul is the form of the body. What this meant for Aristotle is that the soul just is the totality of our biological functions. All of the features that we might attribute to the soul, desires, sensations, volitions, can be reduced in one way or another to the function of our biological organs. And it is for this reason that Aristotle's soul is considered to be highly naturalistic, to the extent that we might hesitate, according to modern linguistic convention, to call it a soul at all. Nevertheless, we must also remember that Aristotle did not, as any respectable scientist should not, jump to conclusions that surpassed his available evidence. And this caused Aristotle to hold one important reservation about his metaphysics of the soul. Aristotle acknowledged that there was, insofar as he could rightfully determine given his evidence, one feature of the soul that he could not with any certainty reduce to any particular bodily function. That was the human power of creative reason. Aristotle did not think that he was in a position to either affirm or deny that creative reason was the function of a bodily organ. So he remained a skeptic on that feature of the soul's nature. Perhaps it could, one day, be reduced to a bodily organ, but perhaps not. This is important because it left the door open for future theorists to combine Aristotle's naturalism with a degree of metaphysical speculation, a point which allowed Aristotle's ideas to enter alongside those of Plato much later theological discourse. Following the golden age of ancient Greece, while an interest in the soul did continue into the Greco-Roman period, there was little advance on earlier theories. Real change to ideas about the soul began to emerge with the rise of Christianity and Christian theology throughout the Middle Ages. The aim of the theologians was to combine the apparent truths of reason with certain unquestionable theological convictions. The reasoned part of their interpretations, for the most part, they inherited from the Greeks, although with some disagreement over the centuries. The early 5th century CE theologian St. Augustine, for one, adopted a distinctly Platonic view of the soul. He held, perhaps first among the Church Fathers, that the soul belonged to an immaterial Platonic-like realm, independent of the physical body. In contrast, the later 13th century theologian St. Thomas Aquinas, inspired by Islamic commentaries on Aristotle, took a more Aristotelian approach to the soul. He held, like Aristotle, that the soul was the form of the body, but given that his theological convictions would not allow him to say that the soul just was the physical body, he also held that this form was a separable form, thus adding a perhaps inconsistent dose of Platonic thought to his otherwise Aristotelian account. Whatever the case may be, it is the unquestionable theological convictions of these theologians that marked a shift in focus when it came to the soul. These convictions included some more unusual beliefs, such as Aquinas' belief that one of the greatest pleasures of heaven was being able to watch the torment of the damned in hell. But they also included the more prosaic, usual beliefs, that there is a God, that the soul is immortal, and so on. One conviction, however, that appears to have had a considerable impact on the course of the history of the soul is the belief that man was made in the image of God. This belief set the theologians and the Middle Ages on a path that was not present for the Greeks. For Plato, the soul had a perfect form, but so did everything else. For Aristotle, the soul was human functioning, but everything else also had a function in a grand metaphysical scheme. But for the theologians, the focus was squarely upon man. That is why Augustine said that of all things, the human soul is that which is closest to God. In this sense, the theologians of the Middle Ages took a step away from the ever-present undercurrent of animistic thinking that was common to Greek thought. Everything was no longer, as Thales said, full of gods. Instead, the historical process of extracting the soul from nature and of limiting it to man had begun. A process that came sharply into focus as we passed through the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment. At the turn of the 17th century, this removal of the soul from nature continued. But it was no longer just for theological reasons. It was also for scientific reasons. For the scientific mechanization of nature had begun, and it was putting pressure not just on animistic thinking, but also on the soul of man. The great minds of Kepler and Galileo had at this point advanced a quantitative study of nature, which laid the groundwork for an empirically successful, mechanistic view of the world. This view made it clear that the addition of a universal animating feature to explain the change in the world was not required. This new atmosphere of scientific progress raised an important question, a question that continues to maintain its grip on the world today. Is there room in a purely mechanistic world for the soul? At this point in history, one man stood out for his reasoned defense of the soul. The French mathematician, scientist, theologian, and father of modern philosophy, René Descartes. Descartes, like many of his contemporaries, was committed to a mechanistic view of the world, including of human biology. But his theological commitments forced him to find a place for the human soul within his system. To do this, he famously reasoned as follows: the existence of the material world, including our human bodies, can be doubted. It might at any moment be the case that I am dreaming, and that my perceptions of the world are mistaken. It might even be the case that for my entire life, I have been deceived by an all-powerful evil demon into believing that the world around me is real, when in fact it is not. There is no way to prove with certainty that this is not the case. But the existence of my mind, my pure faculties of reason, which Descartes identified with the soul, cannot be doubted. The very fact that I can doubt at all implies that I exist as a thinking being. Or, as Descartes himself put it, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This difference for Descartes implied a fundamental distinction between the material world of perception and an immaterial world of the mind or soul. In light of this argument, the mechanization of nature was not a threat to the soul. Everything material could be mechanized, but the soul, now removed entirely from the material world, was safe from scientific reduction. As is always the case, however, there was a problem. In drawing a distinction between the body and the soul, with a kind of crystal-like clarity that it had never seen before, Descartes also revealed the greatest difficulty for body-soul dualism. This difficulty was first expressed by Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia in her correspondence with Descartes. She wrote, "I would find it easier to concede matter and extension to the soul than to concede that an immaterial thing could move and be moved by a body." This problem, known today as the mind-body problem, is that it is inconceivable that something immaterial, i.e. lacking dimensions in space, could causally interact with a material entity. Yes, the soul can be removed from the material world, saving it from scientific annihilation, but in doing so, it loses the features it needs to have any worth within our material existence. It is therefore something of a great irony that in his efforts to save the soul, Descartes, by so clearly distinguishing body stuff from soul stuff, did more to hasten the soul's demise than perhaps any of his predecessors. In the wake of Descartes' extreme dualism, and with the continued success of science, we are now in a position to return to why, at the beginning of the 20th century, William James said that the soul was out of fashion. By this time, among intellectual circles, spiritualistic views had been dispossessed of all their explanatory force. The soul was quickly becoming a myth of times gone by. But the soul's story is not over yet, for the familiar debates about the soul have found a new footing in more naturalistically respectable discussions of the mind, or more specifically, of conscious experience. As some theorists of the past century have pointed out, general Cartesian-esque distinctions between the material world and conscious experience still apply, whether we think of the mind as the soul or not. For one thing, we can all observe a person's brain, or for that matter, the brain of a bat, but none of us can share in the first-person conscious experience of either another person or a bat, as the contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel has pointed out. These kinds of differences, therefore, seem to suggest that there are still important ways in which the objective world of material stuff and the subjective world of mind stuff might be distinct. Descartes would surely have approved. Nevertheless, despite these glimmers of hope for the soul, materialism has continued its march, putting pressure now not just on the soul, but also on the mind. The question that arose about the soul during the Enlightenment hangs today over the mind. How can something as unusual as consciousness have a place in a purely materialistic worldview? The answer, for some of the strictest materialists, has been to try and do away with the mind altogether, as history has tried to do away with the soul. This approach has been adopted by a group of contemporary academics known as the eliminativists, for their attempts to eliminate all references to subjective phenomenal experience. The suggestion is that, strictly speaking, any talk of subjective experience, of belief, of desire, hope, fear, love, or whatever it happens to be, should be replaced with non-subjective scientific notions. Now, while it might seem unusual to say that the mind itself is not real, for does Descartes' dictum, "I think, therefore I am," have no worth at all? This form of hardline materialism is no doubt the natural historical progression from the soul's demise to the demise of the mind. The soul, however, has one final stand to make. It is not so easy to analyse consciousness away. In every idle perception, in every passing thought, in every quiet moment of reflection, consciousness stands right there before us. And no matter how much we might theorise the mind into non-existence, no one can truly convince themselves in their most earnest of moments that their experiences, what they feel from their own perspective, is not really real. It is for this reason, perhaps, that the soul will always have a place in human culture. As we reach the end of our journey, let me know where you stand on the nature of the soul. Does the soul exist, or is it simply an enduring historical fiction? We hope that you've enjoyed this video from Immaterial Minds. Please remember to subscribe and let us know what you think in the comments.